There we are. Okay. Good afternoon. Can you hear me at the back, ladies and gentlemen? Yes, you can hear me at the back. Good. Wonderful. Welcome to the third and last of these talks on various aspects of Jane Austen and her life. Today we're taking a slanty sort of look at her likely views and feelings on one of the hottest and most divisive, thorniest issues of her day, the transatlantic slave trade. Not that she mentions it directly, except just the once in her fourth novel, Emma, but there are clues to her thinking which we can sort of piece together. Clues from Mansfield Park, her third novel, clues from what we know of the social climate of her day, which is a lot, and clues also from three of her favourite authors. Here we see one of the greatest engineering feats of early 19th century England and a source of national pride. The West India Docks on the Isle of Dogs, East London, authorised by Parliament to be built for the West India Company in the year 1802. Jane Austen is 27 in that year, by the way, living with her parents in Bath. On the left, we see huge white warehouses stretching into the distance. To their right, great cargo ships or India men. Each warehouse on the left can hold up to 80,000 barrels known as hogsheads. Just one of those can hold 80 gallons of beer or 1,500 pounds of sugar. Each ship to the right has been carefully adapted to contain either a vast quantity of merchandise or else up to 700 captured and imprisoned men, women and children. Of one such Indiaman, it is said by her captain, John Newton, that name may ring a bell, with our ships the great object is to be full. The slaves lie in two rows, one above each other, close to each other, like books upon a shelf. Later, Newton will become a famous convert to the abolition of the trade. Over the previous 100 years or so, the lucrative Atlantic slave trade or middle passage between England and southwest Africa and the islands of the Caribbean and the southern states of North America had been doing very nicely, transforming Western European economies, not least the British, by trade in tobacco, cotton, slaves, and sugar, which in Jane Austen's day has been compared by marvellous historian Adam Hochschild to oil in ours, in that it was seemingly fundamental, essential to the economy. Cane sugar, of course, in Jane Austen's day, the sugar beet, which, unlike the cane, grows in a temperate climate, was only just starting to be experimented and grown in quantity in France. It would come into its own later in the 19th century, but in Jane's day, cane sugar is the thing. Grown some years before with some success in the islands of the Eastern Mediterranean, but the only thing about that was the winters were too cold. The Caribbean, once it was discovered by Portuguese and Spanish, was a better bet. And by Jane Austen's day, sugar has become basic to Western economies, especially the British. Here we have an advertisement for an auction not only of sugar, but of a ship, the Adventure, launched in Liverpool in 1802, in which the ship you can go and get both sugar and slaves. It's risky, stakes are high. 2 years later, after only 3 voyages as a slave ship, the Adventure would be captured by a French privateer. But it is a risk that investors are keen to take We're all being told to lay off sugar today. Not so in Jane Austen's day. People use it all the time. They use it as a sweetener, as a spice, and as a preservative, blissfully unaware of any link to their decaying teeth, let alone weight. One doctor even recommends cleaning your teeth with sugar. Dental victims probably include Jane Austen's mother, Cassandra, who had lost several of her front teeth by the time Jane was 7 and she was 43. In medieval times, sugar had been a food for princes and the rich. By Jane's day, thanks to mass production in the Caribbean, it is affordable but still something of a luxury. The Austens keep their cone-shaped loaves, not in kitchen or in larder, but in a locked cupboard in the dining room, together with similarly expensive coffee and tea. Jane, in London, writes to Cassandra at Chawton about a nice visit which Cassandra has just received from Brother Charles and his young family. The visit has ended. They have all gone home. You will miss them, writes Jane, but then the comfort of getting back into your own room will be great, and then the tea and sugar, the expense. Back to those docks again, newly built. Their publicity continues thus. Such is the enterprising spirit, commercial knowledge, and liberal conduct of British merchants that their ships are welcome visitants to every part of the globe, where winds can waft and waves can bear them. In Jane's day, and for a long while afterwards, ship owners, chocolate makers, owners of tobacco plantations, and sugar exporters are earning vast fortunes in the islands of the West Indies, mainly owned, though not entirely, by British and French, enabled so to do by a plentiful supply of labour, reliable and cheap. Here we see tobacco being freely offered by happy and willing slaves, especially this one down there, you see, freely offered. Do have some tobacco. In the approving words of James Boswell, biographer of Dr. Samuel Johnson, who comes into this shortly, "Lo, then," writes Boswell, "in yonder fragrant isle, where nature ever seems to smile, the cheerful gang of negroes see perform the task of industry. Even at their labour hear them sing, while time flies quick on downy wing." The Committee for the Abolition of the Slave Trade had been formed in 1787 in the City of London by a group of Quakers who have long viewed slavery as a blight upon humanity and link up with evangelical Protestants to end the trade. Now, here are some, but by no means all, of the most prominent figures of the movement. Top left, Granville Sharp, civil servant and musician. There's a wonderful painting by Zoffany of his whole family, the Sharp family musicians, on a boat. Zachary Macaulay, a merchant who goes out to Jamaica in his youth and is horrified. William Wilberforce in the centre, politician and wonderful orator, very, very wonderful. Thomas Buxton, Quaker brewer, and on the bottom right, the most energetic of them all, Thomas Clarkson. Another influential figure is this man, the ex-slave Oluda Equiano from southeast Nigeria, captured in his homeland, aged 11. He manages to work very hard as a slave, save a bit of money, buy his freedom for £40 in America, and then back in Britain helps to support the end of slavery by sales of his autobiography, which goes into 10 editions. Abolition would take nearly a century in hard-won stages. Not for 30 years would the transportation of slaves on British ships be pronounced illegal, and the year after that, One of the men most responsible for this breakthrough, Thomas Clarkson, writes a history of the abolition movement which Jane Austen, aged 33, must have read, because a bit later, writing to Cassandra about another author she very much admires, a Captain Pasley, she says, "I am as much in love with Captain Pasley as I ever was with Clarkson," whom she never met. She never met either of them. Back shortly to the very interesting Thomas Clarkson, but here we are again with the rectory at Steventon. We know it well by now. Jane's beloved first home deep in the southern county of Hampshire. Like many English families both then and now, the seemingly rural Austens have many connections to the wider world, in particular the Caribbean. Jane belongs to the minor English gentry. She's got lots of cousins. Jane is a sort of permanent poor relation. On both sides of her family there are better off cousins with plantations in Jamaica. Where's Jamaica? There's Jamaica. There it is. Other people have got estates in Barbados, Antigua, and Bermuda. These are all people living in Hampshire who she knows. Mrs. Austen's brother James, Jane's uncle, had married an heiress to estates in Barbados, Mrs. Lee Perrot. An ex-pupil of Jane's father has acres in Antigua, of which he makes George Austen a trustee, so that if he died, Jane's father would have had to look after both the plantation and its slaves. The mind boggles somewhat. Jane's youngest brother, Charles, marries a daughter of the Attorney General of Bermuda. Then when she dies, in childbirth naturally, he marries her sister. Back in Hampshire, there are the neighbours, wealthy neighbours, who kindly pass on their newspapers to the impoverished Austens. These neighbours have lands in Antigua. There is a shocking neighbour in Hampshire, also very wealthy, William Beckford, libertine, bisexual, and Gothic novelist, whose father is so incredibly rich that he is known as the uncrowned king of Jamaica, all dependent on cheap labour provided by that ancient system which has long been accepted as a necessary evil. The country needs it, and if the British were to abandon it, who's going to profit by that? The French. Slavery has always existed somewhere or other, people tell each other. Aristotle took it for granted. More recently, so did the great economist Adam Smith. Starting just before and during the lifetime of Jane Austen, changes take place. And it seems to me that some of these changes will have affected her. 3 years before her birth, a very eminent man, here he is, William Murray, Lord Mansfield, Lord Chief Justice, who looks terribly smooth here, and he probably was, but he had given the very first and limited anti-slavery judgment in England, ruling in 1772 that the owners of a slave by the name of James Somerset from Jamaica might not then, who they'd brought him to England, Lord Mansfield rules that they cannot sell him out of England, get him out of the country and sell him, as they were hoping to do. That was as far as it went. Lord Mansfield was giving a strict interpretation of the law, but he is hailed by the abolitionists, of course, as a hero. Jane would have known of this. Some years later, however, he appears again when, on her way from West Africa to Jamaica, a badly overcrowded slave ship by name of the Zong loses her way, wanders in the ocean for 2 months, having omitted to take on lots of fresh drinking water. The water runs out. Some of the 420 slaves aboard begin to die. Now, the ship's captain has an awful problem here. How is he going to get his money back? He and his investors have paid good money for those slaves. How can they claim the insurance? Under the law of England, only if they can prove that the deaths are due not to negligence, as they were, but to perils of the sea, in which case one is permitted under the law of England to jettison cargo to save the rest. Under the law of England in 1783, slaves are cargo. There is the solution. The captain has 113 more of them thrown overboard. The rest have died of thirst, and later claims in court back in England that the winds had been against him, that's perils of the sea, and that he had rightly jettisoned cargo to save the rest. Well, a painting from a number of years later, 1840, for the horrible scene by the deeply shocked artist Joseph Mallord Turner, who incidentally was born in the same year as Jane Austen. The insurance put up a fight. They weren't having any. The claim in the end was defeated. The captain didn't get his money, nor did he get tried for murder. In court, the judge agreed that it is just as if horses had been killed. And what is a bit hard for us to get our heads around is that the judge was the same judge, Lord Mansfield, giving, as he had done before, a strict interpretation of the law. At the time, the incident was hushed up, but in the end word did leak out, and from then on, furious abolitionists gathered speed. Turner was among the horrified. Years before he painted this, The Slave Ship, he had included the scene in an unfinished poem entitled The Fallacies of Hope. Aloft, all hands, strike topmasts and belay. Yon angry setting sun and fierce-edged clouds declare the typhoon's coming. Before it sweeps your decks, throw overboard the dead and dying. Never heed their chains. Hope, where is thy market now? Now, Jane Austen never says in so many words in any of her surviving letters, that is to say, that she is either for or against the slave trade. She likes her sugar, she likes her tea, she likes probably belonging to the minor gentry, staying in grand houses with servants, partly financed by the trade. She is intensely, passionately patriotic and anti-French. The country needs all the money it can get. Her own Church of England sees nothing wrong in slavery. The topic is thorny. As a novelist, she believes very strongly in writing only about what she knows. And as a prolific writer of letters, so many of which have been burnt, she must know, that letters in her day are likely to be passed round a household as entertainment. You never know who's going to read your letters. The political climate is, to put it mildly, edgy. Here's her niece Caroline. She says, "In vain do I try to recall any expression or word of Aunt Jane's that had reference to public events. However, it is surely of some relevance that Jane's 3 favourite authors are all abolitionists, and we'll have a look at each of them now. Dr. Samuel Johnson, the great moralist and dictionary maker, Jane's favourite writer in prose, according to her brother Henry. Her favourite poet, William Cowper, forgotten today, but in his own day widely read, and the man with whom she claimed to have been in love, literarily speaking, she never met him, Thomas Clarkson, the most energised of them all. 6 foot tall he was, with red hair, though we can't see that under the wig, and apparently with energy to match. Clergyman's son, true child of the Anglican Church, like Jane. Here we see him as a dedicated young student of theology, looking older, of course, because of the wig. He's 28 there. 4 years earlier, a student at Cambridge, Thomas Clarkson had stumbled across the slave trade by pure accident by winning first prize in a Latin essay competition. Hooray! So he enters for another one. He wants another prize. The subject of this next essay happens to be, is it lawful to enslave the unconsenting? He doesn't know, he just wants the prize. So he does a bit of research and he finds himself reading eyewitness accounts in detail by horrified observers of the various brutal ways in which Africans are being captured, transported across the ocean, made use of in the Caribbean, especially sugar plantations, brutally punished and from time to time deliberately burned to death. Young Clarkson is a bit lost. He just wants to impress. He wants the prize. I had expected pleasure from the invention of the arguments, from the putting of them together, and from the thought that I was engaged in an innocent contest for literary honour. But my pleasure was damped by the facts which were now continually before me. In the daytime, I was uneasy. In the night, I sometimes never closed my eyes for grief. It became now not so much a trial for academical reputation as for the production of a work which might be useful to injured Africa. He wins the next Latin prize. He translates his essay then from Latin into English. He reads it aloud at Oxford, and then on his way back to London on horseback, riding through peaceful countryside, possibly such as this, I stopped my horse, I dismounted and walked. I tried to persuade myself that the contents of my essay could not be true, but the more I reflected, the more I gave them credit. Coming in sight of Wade's Mill in Hertfordshire, I sat down on the turf by the roadside and held my horse, and a thought came into my mind that if the contents of my essay were true, it was time some person should see these calamities to their end. He's a vicar's son, he's got connections, he's planning on a nice, comfortable future in the Church of England, but even so, he decides to print his essay and circulate it a bit, see what happens. He looks around for a printer, happens to bump into a Quaker printer, who takes one look at this incendiary essay full of horrible facts, then more or less drags the young man towards a newly formed Quaker group working for abolition. Now, Quakers in this period are still total outsiders. Here's a painting from the previous century. Look at those hats. In Clarkson's day, they still look like this. They're not allowed in universities or the civil service, let alone government. And so, of course, they're delighted to get hold of a keen young member of the establishment. Oh, yes. He joins them. Next morning, he has second thoughts. They're so weird, these Quakers. They refuse to take those hats off, even for the king. They complain about the days of the week being named after pagan names. Wednesday, Woden's Day, Thursday, Thor's Day, Saturday, and so on. I had ambition, a thirst after worldly interest and honours. I could not extinguish it at once, but I felt certain there could be no hope of success in this matter unless except it should be taken up by one who would make it an object for the business of his life, and I urged to myself that never was any cause in any country or in any age so great and important. Never was the one in which so much misery was heard to cry out. Never was the one in which so much good could be done. Never one more worthy of the devotion of a whole life. And that, if a man thought properly, he should rejoice to have been called into it. For years to come, he would ride thousands of miles on horseback round England, collecting more eyewitness accounts, mainly from ex-sailors on slave ships, of the treatment meted out to slaves, and in return to receive death threats in the wealthy slave ports of Liverpool and Bristol, situated so conveniently on England's Atlantic coast. And at some stage, we don't know when, his highly personal account of the abolition movement is read by Jane Austen. And it's irrelevant, surely, that she recalls having once been in love with this man. Now, though Jane may never have known it, there is another of her favourite authors who had always been against the slave trade, a professional one this time, very professional, not like Clarkson. Jane never met him. He died when she was only 9, but at some age, again, we don't quite know when, she had read one of his most famous stories, his first success, I think, the story of Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia. In her 6 major novels, Jane Austen adopts much of Samuel Johnson's moral vocabulary and thinking, as well as his balanced phrases, though hers will be shorter. Now, she may first have come across the revered Dr. Samuel Johnson, compiler of the first proper dictionary of the English language, through her literary brother James, her eldest brother, 10 years older than she and a student at Oxford. Now, James looks sensitive in this portrait. I think it's probably by Cassandra, the portrait, but he doesn't look like the other Austens. They're all tough and they've all got that dreadful tight little mouth, including Jane, but he doesn't have that. Now, in later years, Jane is rude about brother James and still ruder about his second wife, Mary, possibly because, as we saw yesterday, when their father retires from the church, they all have to go to Bath. Not only do James and Mary very quickly take over the rectory, but they buy all the family's books in a hurry at a knockdown price, together with Jane's beloved piano. That's enough, perhaps, to put one off one's dear brother and sister-in-law. But as a child, Jane had looked up to James, who was thought of as being the poet of the family, and who wrote some charming verses, which I've read, some of them funny, some in the person of a cat called Tiger. Now, while at Oxford, James had started a weekly magazine modelled on Samuel Johnson's very well-known periodical, The Rambler, which had been full of little moral essays. There it is on the left. And on the right, Johnson himself on his famous trip to the west of Scotland. In respectful mockery, James calls his own magazine not The Rambler, but, The Loiterer. Very funny. Now, James is said by Brother Henry to have directed young Jane's early reading, and so it could easily have been him who introduced her to Samuel Johnson. Not only does she call Johnson her dear Dr. Johnson, but, stronger, in a poem written aged 30 on the death of her much-admired friend Anne Lefroy, Jane pays this friend the compliment of having been the first of women, just as Dr. Johnson, writes Jane Austen, had been the first of men. Now, Johnson had died in December 1784, famous, very famous, and no fewer than 13 newspapers report his legacy of £70 a year to his black servant, Frank Barber. According to the Bath Chronicle, the doctor asked what he should leave this honest old servant who'd lived with him for 40 years. He was told that a man of the first quality usually bequeathed no more to a faithful servant than an annuity of £50 a year. Why then, said the doctor, tell Frank that I will be above a lord, for I will leave him £70 a year. Now, this is probably Frank as a young man, though we're not quite sure. Little Frank Barber had come to Johnson at the age of 10 as a slave child, a sort of gift from a friend called Richard Bathurst, whose father had great estates in Jamaica. Now, Johnson's wife had just died. He was half mad with grief and with guilt. And it seems this friend thought it would do him good to have a child in the place. And anyway, Frank needed a home. Johnson would feed him and educate him. And most unusually, pray with him, not as master and servant, but both down together on their knees on the floor. Two Christian souls equally in need of salvation. Twice young Frank ran away. Johnson's house was gloomy and dark and full of bad-tempered old people, and everybody read all the time. Johnson worries about him, goes after him, gets him back, gets him educated, hoping to turn the boy into a bookworm like himself. Johnson's friends disapprove, and they disapprove of the legacy of £70, which was widely reported. The Austens would undoubtedly have known it. And 7 years later, when Boswell's biography comes out, Jane is 17, into reading and writing like mad. The family would surely have read of Johnson's cheerful toast, "Here's to the next insurrection of the Negroes in the West Indies." What they can't have known, though, according to historian James Basker of Columbia University, is the longevity of Johnson's deep-seated hatred of the trade, which over the years he had often expressed in print, as we see here, and in the first issue of his literary magazine years ago in the late 40s. He calls Jamaica a place of great wealth and dreadful wickedness, a den of tyrants and a dungeon of slaves. When Lord Mansfield gives his decision, landmark decision, you can't carry a slave out of England and sell him, Johnson agrees and a little bit later passes the judgment up to Scotland to another lawyer acting for another slave, helping to win that slave's freedom. Now, Boswell had apparently started off in favour of abolition, but changed his view over the years in which he was spending a lot of time in London writing Johnson's biography. And today he is suspected of concealing Johnson's passionately held views just at the time the abolitionists were on the verge, in which they failed, of getting the trade put a stop to. The Austens wouldn't have known this either, but they would have read in Boswell's life Johnson's famous comment, which would so annoy Benjamin Franklin. And there it is. Now, Jane's third favourite author, poet William Cowper. Forgotten today, very readable and very popular in his own day. He is another anti-slaver. Romantic poets, Wordsworth and Coleridge, would later call him the pioneer of English romantic poetry. A country boy, unhappy from childhood, owing to the death of his mother when he was 6 and to bullying at school. He tries to kill himself, can't do it, and grows up to identify with all victims of injustice. So as a young man, he finds comfort in nature and writes about life in the English countryside, which will have endeared him to Jane, who writes in a letter that in her view, landscape must be among the joys of heaven. Here's a little snippet from Cowper on a favourite bit of Buckinghamshire. The sloping land recedes into the clouds, displaying on its varied side the grace of hedgerow beauties numberless, square tower, tall spire, from which the sound of cheerful bells just undulates upon the listening ear. Scenes must be beautiful which daily viewed please daily, and whose novelty survives long knowledge and the scrutiny of years. Like Jane Austen, Cowper starts as an Anglican Christian, part of the establishment, but in his 30s, in his late 30s, he comes under the influence of a man we met a little bit a while ago, now rather old, the evangelical John Newton, once a captain of slave ships, by now a passionate abolitionist, who has, among other things, composed the hymn that we all know, Amazing Grace. Cowper converts to evangelicalism. Some of his thoughts on the Almighty become very well known. He composes a poem which will become popular, The Negro's Lament. He puts together a book of hymns, and some years later he writes what would become his best-known work, The Task, a poetic meditation on nature, religion, and England, and attacking evils of the day. According to the Austen scholar Paula Byrne, whose book is on sale up there, the family read excerpts from this very interesting long piece to each other in the evenings, and The Task is Jane's favourite poem. I had much rather be myself the slave, writes Cowper, and wear the bonds than fasten him on him. We have no slaves at home, why then abroad? Slaves cannot breathe in England. If their lungs receive our air, that moment they are free. The Task is lovely, it's readable, and it's on the web. Here we see Thomas Clarkson's campaign chest, into which he puts things collected from crew members of slave ships, and he carries it about with him on horseback, shows it to people. Inside, he puts products from West Africa other than slaves. Natural things, bits of wood, seeds, spices, gum, manufactured things, rope, woven and dyed cloth, leather sandals, bags woven from dried grasses. And as he tours these slave ports of Liverpool, Bristol, and London, at increasing personal risk, he purchases another class of things which are being made in England with profit, and he shows these two: leg shackles, handcuffs, a thumb screw, and a delightful thing used to wrench open a person's mouth to force them to eat. And he shows his diagram of a fully loaded slave ship which carried slaves from the Gold Coast to Jamaica. This had a powerful effect in a time before photography, as did this woodcut of the same image. The Abolition Committee has 7,000 copies printed of this, and they were hung on the walls of homes throughout the country, and it begins to turn up in newspapers and magazines. Whether the Austens owned one, we do not know, but they will without any doubt have seen one. And they will have seen this by the hugely successful potter Josiah Wedgwood, friend of Thomas Clarkson. This medallion also would be mass-produced in useful forms. You could wear it as a bracelet, or you could wear it as a pin in your hair, writes Thomas Clarkson, and ladies did. The taste for wearing it became general, and fashion, which usually confines itself to worthless things, was seen for once promoting justice, humanity, and freedom. Twice in the early 1790s, a bill to effect the instant abolition of the trade went down in Parliament. Too many MPs have nice investments in the West Indies. But by the time Cassandra and Jane Austen are 18 and 16, the anti-slavery movement is gathering pace in the country at large, particularly among the women, giving birth to something new in England, though not in America, which has just made use of it, a boycott, in this case a sugar boycott, not tea. But here's Clarkson again, very happy. There was no town through which I passed, from Cornwall to the North Sea, from the Midlands to the Highlands of Scotland, in which there was not some one individual who had left off the use of sugar. In the smaller towns, 10 to 15 people. In the larger, from 2 to 500. Even grocers had given up trading in it. As we know, no sweeteners in those days, tough giving up sugar. One clergyman who can't resist it carries his own sugar about with him, produced in India by free labour, when he calls on parishioners, so he won't be tempted to use slave-grown sugar. Children give up sugar. One little boy stops polishing his shoes because someone tells him shoe polish has got sugar in it, although maybe that was just an excuse. And in many kitchens, the women stop cooking with sugar. On returning to my home, I found the females in my absence had perused a pamphlet causing them to leave off sugar and to banish it from the tea table. Where in 1791, Cassandra Austen is 18 and a half, Jane is 16. Near them, in Hampshire and in Dorset, in cities in Southampton and Portsmouth and Dorchester, and even little villages, Cerne Abbas, Sturminster, Newton in Dorset, ordinary people who don't yet have the vote are getting up petitions. Leading figures from the arts are involved. Wordsworth, Coleridge, Hannah More, once a playwright, now evangelical writer and teacher, and Jane's beloved William Cowper. I can't believe the Austens will have remained untouched. 2 years later, however, across the Channel, events there produce a crackdown in England of liberal sentiment, and these are the years in which the 18-year-old Jane is composing Eleanor and Marianne and Pride and Prejudice. These years, and the years get worse. In France, 2 years later, they execute their king. In the Caribbean, there is a slave rebellion which succeeds. In England, the establishment, very unpopular, has its back to the wall. For some years now, the king has been on and off mad. No one can stand his heir, the future George IV. The south coast is threatened by the French. Jane Austen, the years in which Jane Austen writes her early novels are a time of such fear that they have been compared by one historian to what it must have been like living behind the Iron Curtain, and the criminal code is really very similar. Treason, once confined to plotting to overthrow and kill, in these years includes writing or even distributing a faintly seditious leaflet, just as it would do under Stalin. And the opinions of a woman writer are under particular scrutiny. Shortly after Jane's death, her brother Henry, who has helped her a lot with publication, writes a memoir in which he makes her sound, perhaps to our eyes, really rather boring, completely taken up by home life. All she ever wanted, says dear Henry, nothing much really interested her, and what she was really, really good at was satin stitch. Today's biographers, of course, take issue with this, but he's got contacts in publishing, brother Henry. He's got his reasons. He knows what he's on about. Another female novelist of the day tells us this: women writers are tried in the court of public opinion, not merely of writers, but as women, while malignant ingenuity is unwearied in finding out their errors and exposing their foibles. If you want to sell as a woman writer, don't stick your neck out. Well, so many of Jane's letters are destroyed. There's so much we don't know. Our guesses can be neither proved nor disproved. As we saw 3 years before Jane's birth, slavery in England itself had been outlawed by the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Mansfield. Because of those wars with France mainly, it takes the abolitionists another 30 years to go further. Not until 1807 do they put a stop to the carriage of slaves on British ships. 4 years after that, living now in the village of Chawton in Hampshire, 38-year-old Jane Austen composes a new novel, her third novel, and gives it the name not of a person, but of a beautiful and fictional property and estate. The Lord Chief Justice, Lord Mansfield, had died back in the 1780s. His name is still well known, connected with that first landmark slavery judgment, not the second. He had lived in the stately home, very nice, of Kenwood, near Hampstead in London. Not only had he ruled that a slave couldn't be carried out of England by force, but he'd taken into his grand house an illegitimate girl of distinct colour, Dido Elizabeth Bell, natural daughter of Lord Mansfield's nephew and of a slave woman from the British West Indies called Maria Bell. Lord and Lady Mansfield had no children. They have Dido educated alongside their own legitimate great-niece, Lady Elizabeth Murray, and Lord Mansfield was to leave Dido fairly well off at his death. He was fond of her. And it is nice that the artist, who may or may not be Zophany, this is not sure either way, has Lady Elizabeth extending a supportive arm towards her cousin. Whether she needs it or not, Dido is said to have had great spirit. Now to another young girl, very different from Dido. The only thing they have in common is they are both poor relations. We met her yesterday. I am referring to Fanny Price in Mansfield Park, a shy, frightened little girl who arrives in Mansfield Park, the title of Jane's novel, as the 10-year-old niece of Sir Thomas Bertram. We see her on the left, with the bone idol Lady Bertram, who cares for nothing but her pug dog, as we see here on the left, and for having little snoozes, as we see on the right. Very nice. And so poor young Fanny is left alone to be bullied by her frightful aunt, Mrs. Norris, as we see on the left. I can't see anything from here at all. Oh, there we are. There's Mrs. Norris. Yes. In fact, Fanny's situation in Mansfield Park has been compared to slavery by various scholars, though never by the author herself. Fanny has character and integrity. She grows up to deal well with problems, to stand up for herself, and to refuse her well-off but dubious admirer. Oh, that's interesting. Where is he? Henry Crawford. That's Mrs. Norris again. She's not supposed to be there at all. Oh, there he is. That's Henry Crawford. Well, as you probably know, I'm sure you've read the novel at some point, she turns him down to the annoyance of his sister, Mary. Yes, there she is. Very, very annoyed. Now, Mansfield Park itself is supported by Sir Thomas's sugar plantations in Antigua, worked by slaves, and Fanny is the only character in the novel who dares to bring these slaves up to her uncle, Sir Thomas, their owner. She doesn't get far because, she says later, there was such a dead silence. This silence is from Sir Thomas's daughters who are there at the time, and it is the subject of much dead work, this guesswork, this dead silence. Are the girls slightly embarrassed? Are they not interested? Or do they know perfectly well that their lifestyle is supported by the degradation of others and choose knowingly to turn a blind eye? The author doesn't say, and we don't know. This dead silence is left hanging in the air. Now back, I hope, to the awful aunt. Yes, Mrs. Norris, who treats Fanny like a slave. Now, there was in real life a slave trader called Norris, of very bad repute. Jane will have read about him in Thomas Clarkson's book, and could well, it is thought, have given this name to this aunt, there she is again, who is one of the nastiest female characters in the whole of Jane Austen. Another name in Mansfield Park is that of a prosperous street in northwest London, Wimpole Street. We connect it today with established members of the medical and dental professions. In Jane's day, This street, Wimpole Street, was the abode of wealthy families connected with the slave trade. The name of one of these real-life families appears in Mansfield Park among the friends of the dubious Crawford brother and sister, Henry and Mary. And just perhaps the connection with Wimpole Street is the author's way of telling us that this brother and sister are not to be trusted. Well, these widely known names, Mansfield, Norris, Wimpole Street, indicate well-known pro- and anti-slave groups, and it's very hard to believe Jane Austen didn't know. It is her next novel, Emma, which contains her one and only direct reference to the trade, together with another relevant name which she gives to another unpleasant character in the book. This name is Hawkins. Back in the days of Queen Elizabeth I, there was a real-life Hawkins, Sir John Hawkins, pirate, navigator, and the first slave trader in England. And here he is, having done very nicely. For years, the Portuguese and Spanish had been at it. Sir John, sometimes in the late 16th century, has a good look at what they're doing, copies them, buys slaves from West Africa, sells them to Spain, makes a lot of money. All right, now, so that's Hawkins. Now we have Emma again, depicted now by Hugh Thompson, Jane's main illustrator. There she is, awfully sweetly, on the left, putting a pillow behind the head of her rather pathetic old father. And on the right, here she is, with being admired by this smarmy admirer, who she can't be doing with at all, the clergyman Mr. Elton, in search, of course, of a rich wife. Rejected by Emma, Mr. Elton gets hold of a Miss Augusta Hawkins from Bristol with 10,000 a year. And here we are together in a TV version of the book, very pleased with each other and themselves. Miss Hawkins, says the author, is the daughter of a Bristol merchant, of course, he must be called. Well, what does that mean? Possibly, coming as he does from the slave port of Bristol, that he is a trader, and this is probably true of Miss Hawkins' entire family. Her elder sister was very well married to a gentleman in a great way near Bristol who kept 2 carriages. He was the pride of the alliance, and his place and his carriages were the pride of him. This new Mrs. Elton is always on about these 2 carriages and about her brother-in-law's extensive grounds. And she tries to compliment Emma without success by comparing Emma's home in the village of Highbury to her brother-in-law's grand place, which is called Maple Grove. And it is not merely the house, the grounds, I assure you, are strikingly like. The laurels at Maple Grove are the same profusion as here and stand much in the same way. My brother-in-law and sister will be enchanted by this place. People who have extensive grounds themselves are always pleased with anything in the same style. Emma doubted the truth of this sentiment. She had an idea that people who had extensive grounds themselves cared little for the extensive grounds of anybody else. And it's through Mrs. Elton that Austen makes her only direct reference to the trade. She turns up again with another young woman, a poor young woman, Jane Fairfax, who's having to apply for a position as a governess. She doesn't know where. She hates the idea. Mrs. Elton tells her to get on with it, offering to recommend poor Jane to a frightful-sounding woman called Mrs. Bragg. "Thank you," says Jane, "but I would rather you did not mention me to Mrs. Bragg. I am not afraid of being long